They say that still waters run deep, but they forget to mention what breathes beneath the surface. We are taught to look for monsters in the shadows, the disheveled, the desperate, the obviously broken. But the most dangerous predators don't hide in the dark. They hide in plain sight, wearing the face of a straight A student, a devoted daughter, a woman with a bright future. In the quiet suburban streets of Highland Heights, Kentucky, that mask didn't just slip, it danced. Shayna Hubers was the girl who had everything: intelligence, beauty, and the kind of academic pedigree that opens every door. But when the man she claimed to love tried to close just one door on her, the golden girl vanished, and something ancient and hollow took her place. This is not just a story of a murder. It is a clinical descent into the mind of a woman who believed her ego was more precious than a human life. It is the story of a man who died because he dared to want a life without her, and a woman who spent her first hours of grief twirling in an interrogation room, more concerned with her reflection than the body cooling on a hardwood floor. Pour yourself a drink, dim the lights, let's look behind the mask. Your likes and comments help promote our videos, and please subscribe to Crime Queen if you appreciate high-quality true crime videos. Thank you. To understand the tragedy of Ryan Poston, one must first dismantle the myth of Shayna Hubers. We often search for a smoking gun in a killer's past, a history of abuse, a childhood of deprivation, or a sudden, traumatic break from reality. But Shayna's origin story offers no such easy comfort. She was born and raised in Lexington, Kentucky, in a world that felt as stable and polished as the hardwood floors she would eventually stain with blood. Her family was the definition of middle-class respectability. Her mother was a school teacher, her father a retired musician. There was music in the house, a premium on education, and an unwavering expectation of excellence. From the moment she entered the Kentucky public school system, Shayna didn't just participate, she dominated. She was the girl whose name was always on the honor roll, the one who sat in the front row, hand perpetually raised, eyes fixed on the teacher with an intensity that bordered on the performative. To her teachers, she was a dream. To her peers, she was a daunting presence. She wasn't just smart, she was aggressively intelligent. She didn't just want the A, she wanted the highest A in the class. She was a straight A student, an academic powerhouse who moved through her teenage years with the calculated precision of a chess grandmaster. But if you look closer at the archives of her youth, a pattern emerges, not of a girl who loved to learn, but of a girl who loved to be perceived as the best. In a narcissistic psyche, achievement isn't a goal, it's a defensive wall. Every academic award, every high test score, and every praise-filled report card was a brick Shayna laid to protect a very fragile, very hollow core. She was building a persona of the golden girl, a woman of such intellectual and social standing that she would be untouchable. As she transitioned into her college years at Morehead State University, Shayna chose to major in psychology. It was a choice dripping with irony. While she studied the nuances of human behavior, the mechanics of empathy, and the triggers of the human mind, she was simultaneously perfecting her own ability to mimic them. Psychology gave her a vocabulary for her own manipulation. She didn't just feel emotions, she analyzed them as tools. She learned how people worked so she could better understand how to move them like pieces on a board. Those who knew her during this period describe a young woman who was intensely talkative, but the conversation was a one-way street. She would speak for hours about her own thoughts, her own beauty, and her own intellectual superiority. There was a clinical coldness to her vanity. She wasn't just vain in the way a teenager might be, she was preoccupied with her own legend. She would often comment on her own high IQ, as if her intelligence was a physical weapon she carried in her purse. In the humid Kentucky summers, as she approached her early 20s, the mask was at its most perfect. She was 5 feet, 8 inches of polished potential. She volunteered, she studied, she stayed out of trouble. On paper, She was the daughter every parent wanted. But the cracks were beginning to show in the way she handled rejection, or rather, the way she didn't. For Shayna, a B on a paper wasn't a mistake. It was an insult. A friend's disagreement wasn't a difference of opinion. It was a betrayal. She lived in a binary world. You were either a devotee to her brilliance, or you were an enemy to her ego. She was a woman who lived in the all or nothing. This rigidity is a hallmark of the narcissistic personality. When the world reflects your perfection back to you, you are charming, witty, and kind. But the moment the mirror cracks, the moment someone implies you are ordinary or worse, replaceable, the golden girl evaporates. By 2011, Shayna was 20 years old, standing on the precipice of adulthood. She had the grades, she had the looks, and she had the psychology of a predator. She was looking for a partner who could serve as a mirror, someone handsome enough, successful enough, and worthy enough to reflect her own perceived greatness back at her. She wasn't looking for love, she was looking for a male version of herself. She wanted a trophy that could also give her the validation she so desperately craved. It was during this time that her obsession with status reached its fever pitch. She was obsessed with the way she was perceived by men, often tracking her own desirability with a mathematical coldness. She was a woman who viewed relationships as a series of transactions. She would give her brilliance, and in return, she expected total, unwavering adoration. She was a ticking clock, though no one knew it yet. The academic success had given her a sense of omnipotence. She believed she could outthink anyone. She believed her straight A status made her morally superior. She was the perfect Kentucky girl, a product of a good home and a better education. But the foundation was built on sand. Beneath the honors degree and the practiced smile sat a deep, roiling sea of entitlement. She was waiting for the one person who would finally tell her no. She was waiting for the person who would dare to look at the golden girl and see something ordinary. And then, through the digital ether of Facebook, she found Ryan Poston. Ryan was everything she wanted on paper. He was 29, a successful lawyer, tall and classically handsome. He was the prize. When they began talking, Shayna didn't just see a boyfriend. She saw the ultimate validation of her own status. If a man like Ryan Poston wanted her, then she truly was the queen of the room. But what Ryan didn't realize, what he couldn't have known as he typed those first few messages, was that he wasn't entering a romance. He was entering a cage. Shayna Hubers had spent 20 years perfecting the role of the perfect woman. She had studied the scripts, she had learned the cues, and she had built the set. Now she finally had her leading man. The tragedy was that in Shayna's world, the leading man only has two options. He can stay on script and adore her forever, or he can be written out of the story entirely. As the winter of 2011 turned into the spring of 2012, the Golden Girl was ready for her greatest performance. And the setting, a quiet apartment in Highland Heights, was already being prepared for the final, bloody act. The initial spark between Shayna Hubers and Ryan Poston didn't ignite in a crowded room or through a chance encounter at a Lexington coffee shop. It began in the curated digital world of Facebook, a medium perfectly suited for a narcissist to craft a persona. In the beginning, it was a high-octane intellectual pursuit. Ryan was a 29-year-old attorney with a sharp legal mind and a pedigree from the Salmon P. Chase College of Law. Shayna was the 21-year-old honors student who could keep up with his wit, match his vocabulary, and provide the kind of intense, flattering attention that can be mistaken for soulmate-level passion. But for Shayna, Ryan wasn't just a partner, he was an acquisition. To have a successful, handsome lawyer on her arm was the ultimate social currency in the hills of northern Kentucky. It validated everything she believed about herself, that she was elite, that she was desirable, and that she belonged in the upper echelons of society. However, the honeymoon phase was not a period of growth, but the beginning of an encroaching fog. Shayna's love was not a gift, it was a tax. The cracks in the relationship appeared almost immediately, though they were often disguised as passion or intensity. Shayna didn't just want to be part of Ryan's life, she wanted to be the only thing in it. Her need for validation was a bottomless pit that no man could ever hope to fill. If Ryan was at work, she was texting. If he was with his family, she was calling. If he was asleep, she was monitoring his social media. She was a woman who translated any moment of his independence as a direct act of psychological violence against her. As 2012 progressed, the dynamic shifted from romantic to predatory. Ryan, a man known for his laid-back demeanor and love for his family, began to feel the walls closing in. He tried to end the relationship dozens of times. He would tell her it wasn't working, that they were too different, that the intensity was too much. But in the mind of a malignant narcissist like Shayna, no is not an answer. It is a challenge. Every time Ryan tried to break free, Shayna would pivot. She would use her psychology background to manipulate his guilt. She would threaten self-harm, she would show up at his doorstep at 3 a.m., or she would use sex as a tether to pull him back into her orbit. The digital evidence recovered later would show a woman who had transformed from a girlfriend into a stalker. She sent him over 100 texts a day. When he didn't respond, the tone shifted from "I love you" to "I hate you" within minutes. She was obsessed with his vanity, often projecting her own insecurities onto him. She would criticize his looks, his career, and his family, all while refusing to let him go. She was devaluing him so that he would feel he had no choice but to stay with her. It was a classic Black Widow maneuver. Paralyze the prey so they can't fly away. By the summer of 2012, Ryan was living in a state of constant anxiety. He told his friends he was scared of her. He changed the locks on his condominium in Highland Heights. He told his father, Jay Poston, that Shayna was crazy and that he couldn't get her to leave him alone. Yet Shayna's public mask remained flawlessly in place. To her professors and family, she was still the bright, achieving student. But behind closed doors, she was a woman obsessed with the script. If Ryan wouldn't play the role of the adoring husband-to-be, she would rewrite the ending of the play. The ultimate motive for the murder wasn't jealousy, it was narcissistic injury. A narcissist's greatest fear is not being unloved, it is being irrelevant. It is being told that they are not special. When Ryan finally made it clear that he was moving on, specifically when he made plans to meet Audrey Bolt, a Miss Ohio contestant, he did the one thing Shayna could not forgive. He chose someone else. He chose a woman whose beauty was officially certified by a crown. To Shayna, this was a personal execution of her ego. If Ryan left her for a beauty queen, it proved that Shayna was less than. In her mind, the logic was chillingly simple. If she could not own the mirror that reflected her greatness, she would smash it so no one else could look into it. She began to prep her defense long before she ever touched a gun. She texted friends about how mean Ryan was. She hinted that he was abusive, despite there being no evidence of physical violence on his part. She was building a narrative of self-defense as a contingency plan. She even joked to a friend that she could shoot him and get away with it because of her clean record. She wasn't an impulsive killer. She was a cold-blooded tactician who viewed the legal system as just another test she could ace. As the date of October 12, 2012 approached, the Black Widow had spun her web. She knew Ryan was going on a date that night. She knew he would be getting ready, feeling happy, feeling free. And that freedom was an insult she intended to correct. She didn't want his money. She didn't want his house. She wanted his life because he had dared to tell her that she wasn't enough. She spent the days leading up to the murder in a state of high-functioning rage. To the world, she was just a student walking across campus with her books. But inside, she was calculating the distance, the angles, and the story. She was a psychology major who had decided that the ultimate psychological experiment was to see if she could kill a man and make the world weep for her. The golden girl was gone. The predator was hungry, and Ryan Poston was about to pay the ultimate price for wanting a life of his own. The air in Kentucky was getting colder as October took hold, but inside Shayna Huber's, the temperature had already dropped to absolute zero. She wasn't going to his apartment to talk. She wasn't going to plead for one last chance. She was going to ensure that Ryan Poston's last memory was her face, and that he would never have the chance to look at another woman again. The motive was vanity, the method was execution, and the result was a tragedy that Highland Heights would never forget. Friday, October 12, 2012. The sun began its slow descent over Highland Heights, Kentucky, casting long, bruised shadows across the manicured lawns and brick facades of the condominium complex on Carruthers Road. The temperature was a mild 62 degrees Fahrenheit, a perfect, crisp autumn evening that should have been the backdrop for a new beginning. Inside Unit 201, 29-year-old Ryan Poston was moving with a lightness he hadn't felt in nearly 2 years. He was a man who had finally stepped out from under a heavy, suffocating shroud. He was trimming his beard in the bathroom mirror, selecting a clean shirt and checking his watch. In a few hours, he was supposed to meet Audrey Bolte for drinks. He wasn't just going on a date. He was reclaiming his identity from the woman who had tried to consume it. But at 8:50 p.m., the peace was shattered by a sound that Ryan had grown to dread, the specific rhythm of a knock that belonged to only one person. Shayna Huber's had arrived. She didn't come with flowers or an apology. She didn't come to talk in any traditional sense. She entered the apartment like a ghost returning to a house it refused to leave. When she stepped across the threshold, the very air in the room seemed to thin. Ryan, ever the gentleman, perhaps to his ultimate detriment, allowed her in. He sat at his dining room table, his laptop open, his mind likely already halfway to his date. He was exhausted by her. He didn't want to fight. He wanted a finale. But for Shayna, the finale had to be written on her terms. For the next 15 to 20 minutes, the apartment became a pressure cooker of narcissistic rage and desperate indifference. Shayna began her usual routine, the accusations, the pleas, the demands for attention. She would later claim he was mean to her, that he called her names and tried to push her out. But forensic evidence and Ryan's own history suggest a man who was simply profoundly done. He wasn't yelling, he was ignoring her. And to a woman like Shayna, being ignored is a fate worse than death. It is the ultimate narcissistic injury. As Ryan sat there, perhaps looking down at his phone, the Golden Girl reached for the weapon. It was Ryan's own gun, a .38 caliber Sig Sauer, kept in the apartment for protection. She didn't hesitate. She didn't tremble. She moved with the cold, rhythmic precision of a person who had already played this scene 1,000 times in the theater of her mind. The first shot was a thunderclap that tore through the domestic stillness. The bullet struck Ryan squarely in the face. It was a horrific, disfiguring wound that shattered his jaw and sent him spiraling from his chair to the floor. The sound of the gunshot echoed off the walls, followed by a silence so heavy it felt physical. In a normal person, the sight of the man they loved with half his face destroyed would trigger a primal scream, a frantic reach for a telephone, a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. But Shayna Huber's didn't scream. She didn't run. She stood over him. The smell of cordite, sharp, metallic, and sulfurous, filled the small dining area. Ryan was on the floor, his body twitching in a reflexive, agonizing struggle for life. He was moaning, a sound Shayna would later describe to police with a chilling lack of empathy. She watched him. She observed his suffering as if she were a scientist watching a specimen under a microscope. And then she decided that he hadn't been corrected enough. She fired again, and again, and again. The second bullet entered his back as he lay face down. The third and fourth followed, tearing into his side and chest. She was finishing him off. 6 shots in total were fired into the body of a man who was already defeated by the first. Each pull of the trigger was a punctuation mark on her narrative. She wasn't just killing him, she was erasing the version of him that dared to reject her. There is a specific sensory hell to those minutes after the final shot. The room was dim, lit only by the glow of the kitchen lights and the flickering screen of the laptop Ryan would never use again. The only sound was the heavy, wet rhythm of blood meeting the hardwood and the distant, muffled sounds of neighbors who had no idea that a life had just been extinguished a few feet away. Shayna stood in the center of the carnage, the gun heavy in her hand. She wasn't in a state of heat of passion. She was in a state of total, absolute control. She would later tell the police, with a disturbing, almost playful tilt of her head, that she gave him the nose job he always wanted. It is perhaps one of the most famous and most repulsive lines in the history of true crime. It reveals the core of her motive: spite. Even as she killed him, she was mocking his appearance, reducing his humanity to a cosmetic flaw she felt empowered to fix with a bullet. But what did she do in the minutes between the final shot and the call to 911? This is where the slow burn horror of the case truly lies. Most killers flee or immediately call for help in a panic. Shayna waited. She spent 10 to 15 minutes alone with the corpse of Ryan Poston. She didn't try to save him. She didn't hold his hand. She likely spent those minutes composing herself. She needed to transition from the executioner back into the victim. She had to rehearse the shaky voice, the terrified cadence, the I had no choice defense. When she finally picked up the phone at 8:53 p.m., the performance began. "I killed my boyfriend," she told the dispatcher. Her voice wasn't the scream of a woman who had just survived a life-and-death struggle. It was flat. It was calculated. It was the voice of a student turning in a difficult assignment. As the first responders raced toward Carruthers Road, Shayna didn't use the time to pray. She didn't use it to weep. She stood in the apartment, surrounded by the physical evidence of her cruelty, and waited for her audience to arrive. She was about to be the center of attention, the protagonist of a tragedy that she had directed, produced, and starred in. The sensory details of the scene when police arrived were haunting. The officers found a young woman who was remarkably calm. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no bruises on her skin, just a dead man on the floor, and a young woman who seemed more concerned about the blood on her clothes than the blood on the floor. "I'm not a murderer," she would later say. "I'm a survivor." But as the police began to process the scene, the Day X chronology revealed the truth. The shots were fired from a distance that precluded a struggle. The angles proved he was sitting or lying down when hit. The sheer number of bullets, 6, shouted the word execution. Ryan Poston had been murdered in his own home while getting ready for a date by a woman who believed that if she couldn't have his heart, she was entitled to his head. The sun had fully set now. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers danced against the windows of Unit 201, a strobe light of suburban nightmare. As Shayna was led out in handcuffs, she didn't look back at the home where Ryan lay. She looked at the cameras. She looked at the officers. She was already thinking about the interrogation room. She was already preparing for the dance. The Day X didn't end with a bang. It ended with the cold, metallic click of handcuffs and the realization that for Shayna Hubers, the death of Ryan Poston was just the beginning of her new, more famous life. She had traded a boyfriend for a legacy of infamy, and she didn't seem to mind the price at all. The sirens had faded into the background hum of the Highland Heights night, replaced by the sterile, fluorescent buzz of the police station. Shayna Hubers sat in an interrogation room, a small, windowless box where the air always feels a few degrees too cold and the clock on the wall ticks with an accusatory rhythm. Most people brought into these rooms after a fatal shooting are catatonic, trembling, or draped in the heavy shroud of shock. But Shayna was just getting warmed up. The mask of the grieving girlfriend was already beginning to slip, not because she was cracking under pressure, but because she couldn't resist the urge to perform. As the detective stepped out of the room, leaving the cameras to roll, the world was granted a front-row seat to one of the most disturbing displays of narcissistic detachment ever captured on film. She didn't pace in circles out of guilt. She didn't collapse in prayer. Instead, she stood up and began to dance. With the blood of Ryan Poston quite literally still under her fingernails, Shayna twirled. She sang to herself, fragments of Amazing Grace and I Feel Pretty, as if the interrogation room were a backstage dressing room and the murder of her boyfriend was merely the opening act of her rise to fame. It was a vaudeville of the macabre. She checked her reflection in the two-way glass, smoothing her hair, adjusting her glasses, ensuring that even in the wake of a homicide, she remained camera-ready. When the detectives returned, the dialogue shifted from the tragic to the surreal. Shayna didn't ask if Ryan had a chance of survival. She didn't ask about his family. Instead, she spoke about herself, incessantly. She worried aloud about how this incident would affect her reputation. She lamented that it would be difficult to find a new husband now, because she was a murderer. She spoke about the stigma as if it were a stain on a designer dress rather than a life sentence for taking a human life. "He's very vain," she told the officers, speaking of the man she had just shot 6 times. "He's got a nose job, or he wanted one, and I shot him right here. I gave him the nose job he wanted." The detectives, seasoned men who had seen the worst of Kentucky's underbelly, sat in stunned silence. There was no heat of passion here. There was no fear for her life. There was only a cold, vibrating arrogance. She described the act of finishing him off with the same emotional weight one might use to describe discarding a piece of broken furniture. She told them he was moaning on the floor, and so she shot him again to end his suffering, not out of mercy, but out of a desire for the noise to stop. The suspicions didn't just crawl into the room, they slammed the door shut. Her version of events, a harrowing tale of self-defense against a man twice her size, began to crumble under the weight of her own vanity. She claimed Ryan was abusive, yet she was the one who had forced her way into his home. She claimed she was terrified, yet she spent her solo time in the interrogation room laughing and snapping her fingers. To the police, it became clear. This wasn't a woman who had survived an attack. This was a woman who had executed a plan and was now annoyed that the paperwork was taking so long. Outside the station, the news was beginning to break. Ryan Poston's family was receiving the kind of phone call that stops time. Their son, the brilliant attorney, the man who was supposed to meet a date that night and start a new chapter, was gone. And as they mourned, the woman who had ended him was complaining to the police about the stigma of her new title. The first red flags for the investigators weren't just in her words, but in her physical presence. There were no defensive wounds on Shayna, no bruises, no scratches, no signs of the struggle she so vividly described. Her clothes were neat, save for the blood spatter that told a much more violent story than her testimony. She sat 5 feet, 8 inches tall, a woman of intellect and physical capability, yet she played the fragile girl card until the moment it no longer served her. As the sun began to rise over Kentucky, the reality of what had happened in that Highland Heights apartment was coming into focus. This wasn't a case of still waters run deep. This was a shallow pool with a jagged, lethal bottom. The detectives realized they weren't dealing with a victim of domestic strife. They were dealing with a malignant narcissist, a woman who believed that if she couldn't have Ryan's devotion, she was entitled to his pulse. "I'm a very intelligent person," she told the camera when left alone again. "I have a very high IQ." It was her favorite refrain. But she was about to learn that all the intelligence in the world couldn't erase the forensic truth. She had shot a man in the back. She had shot a man while he was down. And most damning of all, she had danced while his body was still warm. The mask was off, and beneath it lay a void that no amount of straight-A logic could fill. The investigation was no longer about who did it. It was about proving that the girl who felt pretty was actually a cold-blooded executioner. The detectives of the Highland Heights Police Department didn't need to look far to find a suspect, but they needed to look deep to find the truth. Shayna Hubers had already given them hours of footage, a confession of sorts, and a weapon, but she had also given them a meticulously crafted lie. The exposure phase of the case became a clinical deconstruction of that lie, pitting the forensic reality of a crime scene against the shifting narratives of a narcissist. The first blow to Shayna's self-defense story came from the ballistics report. Forensic investigators spent days inside Ryan's apartment, using laser trajectory kits to map the path of the 6 bullets. In a genuine case of self-defense, there is usually evidence of a struggle: overturned chairs, scuff marks on the floor, or defensive wounds on the survivor. There was none of that in Unit 201. Instead, the evidence suggested a stationary target. The most damning revelation was the location of the wounds. Ryan had been shot while he was sitting down. The angle of the first shot to his face indicated that the shooter was standing above him while he was in a seated, non-threatening position. Furthermore, the shots to his back and side proved that he was either turning away or already on the ground when the final rounds were fired. This wasn't a woman fighting for her life. This was an executioner ensuring her victim couldn't get back up. But the physical evidence was only half the story. To prove the malignant nature of the crime, investigators had to dive into the digital abyss Shayna had left behind. They subpoenaed her phone records and social media accounts, uncovering a year-long campaign of psychological terrorism. The straight-A student was revealed to be a relentless stalker. She had sent Ryan thousands of text messages, sometimes over 100 in a single day, ranging from desperate pleas for affection to vitriolic insults. In one particularly chilling exchange with a friend months before the murder, Shayna openly discussed the idea of killing Ryan. She joked about how she could make it look like self-defense, claiming that because she had no criminal record and Ryan was big, people would believe her. She was premeditating her defense before she had even finalized the crime. It was a textbook display of proactive aggression, a hallmark of narcissistic personality disorder, where the individual plans a violent act to resolve a perceived slight to their ego. The investigators also looked into the abuse Shayna claimed she suffered. They interviewed Ryan's colleagues, his family, and his friends. The portrait that emerged was not of an abuser, but of a victim of high-stakes harassment. Ryan's friends testified that he was terrified of Shayna. He had changed his locks, he had avoided her calls, and he had even sought advice on how to legally keep her away from his home. He was the one being controlled. She was the one holding the leash. As the case moved toward the grand jury, the exposure turned to Shayna's behavior while in custody. Jailhouse informants came forward, claiming that Shayna didn't act like a woman traumatized by a life-altering event. Instead, she reportedly bragged about the murder, mocking Ryan's final moments and expressing zero remorse for his family's pain. She was obsessed with how she appeared on the news, asking if she looked pretty in her mugshot, and wondering if the media would realize how high her IQ was. The detectives realized they weren't just dealing with a murderer, they were dealing with a woman who lacked the basic biological equipment for empathy. Every tear she shed in the interrogation room was analyzed and found to be dry. Every shaking hand was found to be a performance. The exposure was complete. The Golden Girl was a fabrication. Beneath the academic honors and the middle-class upbringing lay a predator who viewed human beings as disposable objects. The investigation had stripped away her shield of perfection, leaving her standing in the harsh light of a Kentucky courtroom, where the straight-A student was about to face the ultimate test of her life. The Campbell County Courthouse became the stage for a legal battle that would twice captivate the state of Kentucky. In 2015, the first trial of Shayna Hubers officially began. For the prosecution, led by Michelle Snodgrass, the mission was clear: pull back the curtain on the golden girl and show the jury the cold-blooded tactician beneath. For the defense, the strategy was to lean into the shattered victim narrative, claiming Shayna suffered from battered woman syndrome and acted out of a desperate primal fear for her life. However, the courtroom didn't just hear testimony, it watched a performance. The prosecution's most powerful evidence wasn't a witness, it was the interrogation tapes. The jury sat in a silence so thick it was suffocating as they watched Shayna twirl, snap her fingers, and sing to herself in the hours following Ryan's death. They heard her clinical, detached voice describe the nose job she gave him. The defense's claim of fear evaporated when contrasted with the footage of a woman who seemed more concerned with her hair than the life she had just extinguished. One by one, Ryan's friends and family took the stand. They spoke of a man who was gentle, professional, and increasingly desperate to escape Shayna's suffocating grip. They dismantled the abuser narrative brick by brick, painting a picture of a man who was being hunted, not a man who was hunting. Then came the forensic experts. They used a mannequin to demonstrate how Ryan was seated, vulnerable and unthreatening, when the first bullet shattered his face. They showed the jury the bullet in his back. The science was undeniable. This was an execution. Shayna herself took the stand, a move that backfired with spectacular precision. She was loquacious, often speaking in a superior academic tone that seemed to grate on the jury's nerves. She attempted to intellectualize her violence, using her psychology background to justify her actions. But under cross-examination, the mask didn't just crack, it shattered. Her high IQ couldn't save her from the common sense of 12 citizens who saw a killer where she saw a survivor. The first jury found her guilty of murder, recommending a 40-year sentence. But then, a legal anomaly occurred. It was discovered that one of the jurors was a convicted felon, which disqualified them from service under Kentucky law. The verdict was thrown out. For Ryan's family, it was a cruel secondary trauma. They would have to endure the entire grisly process all over again. The second trial in 2018 was even more intense. The prosecution was leaner and more aggressive. They introduced new evidence of Shayna's jailhouse behavior, where she reportedly bragged about the nose job and mocked the legal system. The defense tried a different angle, focusing on her mental state, but the result was the same. The second jury deliberated for 5 hours before returning the same verdict: guilty. The climax reached its peak during the sentencing phase. Judge Fred Stein, who had presided over the case for years, spoke with a weary, righteous anger. He noted the total lack of remorse, the cold calculation, and the devastating overkill of the crime. Under the American justice system, for the crime of murder, Shayna Hubers was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 20 years. As the handcuffs clicked into place, Shayna's face remained a mask of defiance. There were no tears for Ryan. There were no apologies to his parents. She walked out of the courtroom with her head held high, a straight-A student who had finally failed the only test that mattered. The legal battle was over, but the damage she had wrought was permanent. The interrogation dancer had been sentenced to a life of silence, leaving the world to wonder how someone so bright could be so utterly dark. The story of Shayna Hubers remains a haunting monument to the terrifying vanity of the modern age. Today, the woman who once defined herself by her high IQ and academic accolades resides within the walls of the Kentucky Correctional Institution for Women. There, her straight-A record is irrelevant, and her pretty face is just a number in a system that does not care about her reflection. She remains a textbook case for criminal psychologists, a chilling study in how a high-functioning mask can conceal a hollow, predatory core. Ryan Poston's legacy is not found in the violence of his end, but in the silence that followed. He was a man who wanted nothing more than to live a life of his own choosing, a right that was stolen by someone who believed she owned his very existence. This case serves as a grim reminder that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes, It twirls in an interrogation room and sings to itself while the world weeps. We are left with the image of that small, windowless room, the dance of a narcissist who thought she could outsmart the truth. Shayna Hubers proved that intelligence without empathy is not brilliance, it is a weapon. As the heavy doors of justice closed, they left behind a sobering lesson. We must look past the polished surface of the perfect person, for beneath the stillest waters, the most patient monsters are often waiting for their turn to dance. Like this story if you found it interesting, and subscribe to the channel. I look forward to reading your thoughts on this case in the comments below.